Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at HK's Gray Room in Ashburn, Virginia, taking a look at one of the most interesting guns that we've ever taken a look at here, and probably one of the most requested. This is the Hk G11. This is a caseless ammunition firing prototype assault rifle that was supposed to equip the entire German army, but didn't. This was also tested by the US and not adopted. And this program actually probably goes back farther than most people think. This development of this rifle and its ammunition, and it's important to remember that as a caseless ammunition rifle, the ammo is basically as important. It requires as much technological development as the firearm itself. And development of this began all the way back in 1967. This was basically a joint project between HK for the rifle and Dynamit Nobel for the ammunition. And they did this kind of on the understanding that the German government was interested in pursuing a more high-tech, small-caliber rifle to replace the G3, despite the fact that the G3 had barely been adopted by that point. This was the introduction of the M16 and the 5.56 caliber cartridge to NATO and Europe and the world, and everyone was very interested in it. And this was what the German government hoped would come of that whole concept. So, project starts in '67. It wouldn't actually be until 1974 that Dynamit Nobel and HK actually got a signed government development contract. Prior to that, they'd been doing this work on their own and hoping and assuming that the government would come back them up financially eventually. Of course, in the early days, it went through a number of major developmental revisions. Dynamit Nobel's actually started with an HK-33 chambered for a very early 4.9 millimeter cartridge. They used that to do some development work. On HK's side, they went through a couple different locking mechanisms. Not surprisingly, one of the very first prototypes was actually a roller delayed system. That was HK's bread and butter, and they originally tried that for what would become the G11. That didn't end up working out. Ultimately, what they went with was a very interesting, basically a drum bolt, where the bolt rotates, but not in the way we're normally used to thinking, where it rotates to unlock. Instead, this was a drum firing this direction that rotated like so, which actually makes a lot of sense with a caseless cartridge. Remember that one of the fundamental characteristics of most modern firearms, virtually all modern, well, in fact, all modern firearms, is that somehow the bolt has to reciprocate backwards to pull this empty case out of the chamber. Well, if you don't have a case stuck in there that has to come out, you can really fundamentally change how the gun works because nothing has to reciprocate backwards. So in this case, what the bolt does is it rotates up, a cartridge is pushed into it. These magazines here on the top hold cartridges stacked vertically. Bolt rotates up, cartridge is dropped into it. The bolt then rotates 90 degrees down, lines the cartridge up with the barrel or the projectile. It's hard to say cartridge because there's no case. Anyway, lines the thing up with the barrel, fires it, and then the chamber is empty. There's no cartridge case left to be ejected. So the bolt can simply rotate up, have another round poked into it, down, fire. And that really changes the concept of how the gun needs to function. So between 1974 and ultimately 1978, there's a lot of developmental work done on this. There were a number of problems with caseless ammunition that had to be addressed. And these are things that are still challenging today. People wonder why we don't have a caseless ammunition rifle in common service anywhere. Well, here are some of the reasons. The cartridges tend to be a bit fragile because they don't have this nice heavy metal case protecting the powder. A caseless round tends to be brittle. If you drop it, it might crack. If it cracks or deforms at all or chips, it might not fit in the chamber. These are problems that had to be addressed. And by the way, one of the ways that the Germans addressed that was by issuing the ammunition in little 10 or 15 round plastic containers that you would use as think of them kind of like fully enclosed stripper clips to charge magazines. You also have a problem of temperature and cook-off. So not only do you not have a metal case protecting the powder to prevent it from heating up, when you stuff it into a hot barrel, you also don't have that cartridge case to expel waste heat from the action. One of the things that cases do that a lot of people don't think about is they take heat out of the gun, heat that otherwise has to go into some component, almost certainly the barrel and chamber. You know, that cartridge case is really hot when it spits out of the gun. That's a good thing. You want that heat out. If you don't have the ability to remove heat like that, it's going to stay in the gun. The barrel is going to get hotter. And now you're stuffing an uncased block of powder into the chamber. You run the risk of cook-offs. And that was one of the major developmental challenges for HK and really for Dynamit Nobel in this project, was develop ammunition that wouldn't cook off so easily. I should point this out for folks who aren't intimately familiar with caseless ammunition. The way this typically works is instead of having your powder as, well, powder or flakes or balls or various granules, instead it's compressed together into a single hard block. It's waterproofed, hardened as much as can be chemically done, and then you embed a bullet in the front and a primer in the back. In theory, the primer goes flying out the barrel with the whole projectile. The bullet, of course, goes flying out, and the powder just goes away, so there's no need for a case. That's how this is, in theory, supposed to work. By 1978, the future of the G11 was largely tied to NATO trials. NATO was, of course, going to adopt a new cartridge to replace the 7.62 by 51 millimeter. And there were a couple of different entries. The US, of course, entered its 5.56 cartridge. The Belgians also entered a 5.56 by 45 cartridge, the SS-109, with a heavier bullet and different bullet construction. The British entered their 4.85 millimeter cartridge from their new SA-80 series of rifles, and the Germans were going to enter this. By 1978, however, it had become clear to the German government that development wasn't going to be done in time. They weren't going to be able to deliver rifles and ammunition sufficient to have a chance of winning the trials. And so they canceled the development project. To the German government at this point, it had already failed, so why dump more money into it? As a result, of course, SS-109, the Belgian cartridge, ended up winning NATO trials and would go on to be standard cartridge for NATO going forward. HK, by the way, would react to this with the Hk G11, which we'll cover in a separate video. At that point, HK and Dynamit Nobel are kind of left holding the bag for this project. They've invested a lot of money. They still see the potential for it. It just needed more time than was available before these NATO trials. So at that point, this kind of turns into a consortium effort because there are a lot of other people who are also very interested in this rifle. In particular, the French working through Giat and the British working through Royal Ordnance. Both expressed a substantial interest. And so development of the gun turned into, well, this consortium effort. They created a company. We'll stay away from the bureaucratic background of how this was all set up. But development would continue even though it didn't have a formal German development contract. And there was kind of a light at the end of the tunnel that appeared in 1982 when the US formally started the ACR program, the Advanced Combat Rifle. The ACR the intention was to develop a rifle that had a better hit probability than a standard M16. And there were 4 main entrants, and one of them was the Hk G11. So the US government was willing to actually fund the project in order to make this happen, and so that kind of picked this back up and gave it new life. With this new development money came a new German development contract in 1984. It wasn't that the German government wasn't interested in the rifle, it's that they hadn't seen any hope of it succeeding, and so they canceled the funding. Well, when new funding had been able to be procured and the development was able to continue, by 84, the German government was like, oh, hey, we're still interested in this. It appears that it's not actually dead. And so HK did get a new round of German government funding as well. And this would lead to, by 1988, about a dozen guns going into actual German troop trials, where they performed pretty well. By 1989, there was the G11 K2, or Construction 2 model, and that's what we have here, by the way. The K2 added 2 spare magazines mounted up on top of the action. These are, by the way, 50-round single stack magazines. With these two spares, the gun has a total of 150 rounds of ammunition right built into it here, which was really quite significant. If you look at this weight-wise, for the same weight that would be required to carry a G3 and 120 rounds of ammunition, or 100 rounds of ammunition, I'm sorry, you could carry this and 600 rounds of ammo. That's a compelling argument. So the German government was actually basically ready to approve this. And in fact, in March of 1990, they did formally certify it as acceptable and good to go for the German military. Plan was get it into production, and they were going to outfit the entire Bundeswehr with the G11 K2. Now, let's pull this apart, and maybe it wasn't such a bad thing for everyone that this didn't go into actual military service. All right, let's go over some of the basics on this boxy-looking thing with a grip and a scope. This is the final production version. This is the K2 version. It has a polymer body housing. Most of the early prototypes had a metal body housing on them. While they were going through the development process to make this more functional, they were, of course, doing everything else as well to improve it, trying to make it lighter, trying to make it simpler, and so on. We have a 4-position selector switch, which is a very HK-like switch. Safe, semi-automatic, 3-round burst, which is fired at about 2,000 rounds per minute, and then full auto, which is fired at 600 rounds per minute. So you did have kind of a standard full auto selector option here, as well as the hyper burst version. Now we should talk about that burst version for just a moment. The idea here was to fire 3 rounds and have the 3rd round leave the barrel before the impact of recoil, before the energy of recoil caused the muzzle to shift. The idea being you had a much better chance of getting a hit with 3 rounds scattered out than with just 1 round at a time. This was the whole fundamental basis for the U.S. SPEW program, the U.S. Salvo program, the U.S. ACR program. These were all built around the idea of improving hit probability without requiring a fundamental improvement in marksmanship. And this was never going to be accepted in the US because it kind of demeans the whole idea of marksmanship. But in the real world of combat, what people are mostly shooting at are fleeting targets. They're poorly visible targets. They are some guy jumps up from behind a rock and makes a quick dash to some other piece of cover. And you don't necessarily have the time to get more than 1 shot off, and it's probably not going to be a perfect shot. And so the theory was, if you can fire multiple projectiles with your one opportunity to take a shot, you stand a better chance of getting a hit. So with that in mind, the G11 was designed with this 3-round burst option at 2,000 rounds per minute. We'll touch in a minute on how that actually functioned. But for now, let's continue going over some of the external bits here. Of course, we have our manufacturer's markings. This particular gun was made in October of 1989 by Hk. The caliber changed a number of times over the development of the rifle. It started out as 4.9, then went to 4.3 millimeters, then it went to 4.75, although the 475 was actually called 4.7 so that it wouldn't be confused with the British 4.85. It ultimately wound up as 4.73. We have this integrated optical sight. This is a 1-power non-magnifying sight, but it does give you a nice optical reticle instead of having to line up iron sights. There was also a 3.5-power version, although this particular one doesn't have it. These 2 little screw ports here are for zeroing, for adjusting your windage and elevation. The magazine release is this rubberized button on the top, so there's no actual hole in the gun. There's a release lever inside the action, which you can activate by pushing down on this guy. And when you do that, it of course releases the magazine. There we go. The center magazine is the one that is actually in use. This is a 50-round single stack magazine. You can see that they have helpfully shown you a diagram of the case so that you don't put the cartridges in backwards. Now, because these things are really long and awkward and you don't really want them hanging off your belt like an 1870s bayonet, With the K2 pattern of the gun, they decided to add some more magazine storage to the gun itself. These mags, while long, are not particularly bulky, and so it's actually a really clever idea to just put 2 more of them onto the outside of the gun. Why not? You've got the space to do it. So there's one. We have these release buttons right here, one on each side of the action. Just push that in, and then the magazine comes out. Note that they also put little plastic flapper doors on those magazine wells to keep dirt out of the action if you didn't have magazines in there. The K2 version also went to this kind of squared off rectangular handguard because it is set up to mount a laser optic under the bore. This one's not functioning at the moment, but that snaps into a little housing right down here. Maybe. There we go. Now, I talked about the use of this rotating drum bolt, and what that means is you basically have a winder instead of a linear charging handle. So there is this handy little arrow there, and in order to charge this, you rotate it like so. 1 full revolution. If we look at the bottom, this is your ejection port. Now, this doesn't normally eject anything, so it normally has this plastic cover on it. However, if you have a misfire, you need some way to be able to clear that from the action. And so when you rotate this thing, it opens up this ejection port. It has a loading finger in there that's going to push the next cartridge into the chamber. When it does that, if there's already a cartridge in there, the new cartridge being put in will push the old one out, and it will fall out this ejection port. So it's important that that stays open. That's the bolt snapping back into firing position, and then our little charging cover goes back. Now for the fun stuff. Let's take it apart. It's actually really easy to take apart. There are just a couple of spring-loaded little tabs. So if I push those in, I can pull off the front part of the body housing, which is just this hollow plastic block. And there is our barrel. All the bulk out front is actually just there to house that guy. We do the same thing on the back. There's a tab here and a tab here. And you can pull off the back. This one is also completely hollow. You can see the little cover for the charging port right there, the ejection port. And that's it for that guy. And then we've got this thing. So this is the infamous action of the gun. Fortunately, we don't have to go use this exclusively. Here at the Grey Room, they also have this dummy version of the entire barreled action. So let me start by giving you just the basic fundamental concept of how this rifle works. Built into this system, we have a recoil spring right here, and we have a gas system right here. This is a gas-operated rifle. It's going to tap gas out of the barrel, use it to rotate this drum bolt to cycle cartridges. Now, in the 600 round per minute standard full auto rate of fire, that's what happens. At the same time, however, there is also a recoil system in this gun. So if you've seen my video on the AN94, you'll remember, hopefully, that with that you have a gun that is kind of a hybrid, both recoil and gas operated. This is similar, although it's actually conceptually a little bit simpler. So when I hold the trigger down on this, I can actually operate the recoil system. Now, this just acts as a buffer. So when you fire, the recoil energy causes this whole thing to cycle backwards. It doesn't actually mechanically operate the gun. That's all done by the gas system. When you put it in 3-round burst, what's going to happen here is it's going to fire the first round, and the gas system will have cycled the action by the time it gets to like here. And then it'll fire a second round, it'll recoil more, And then, if I can hold against the spring, it will eventually, by the time it fires the third round, sorry, this spring's too stiff for me to hold down here with one hand. Basically, this thing is going to reciprocate all the way back over the course of firing 3 rounds very quickly. Right after the third round leaves the muzzle, this is going to hit its end of travel, stop, and that is where the recoil energy actually gets transferred to the shooter, and the muzzle is going to climb. The whole gun's going to bounce backwards when this whole assembly stops moving. So the idea of keeping the muzzle in place for those 3 rounds is done by having this thing fire while it's reciprocating backwards. This is conceptually simpler than the AN-94 because it is caseless. So with the AN-94, it's kind of doing the same thing, but it has to have some way to actually eject that empty casing while it's traveling backwards. The G11 doesn't have to do that. I should point out here, the magazine is connected. The magazine is connected to the whole action. So when this is cycling backwards, its whole feed system is going with it. Everything's right there. It just has to rotate this drum, feed a cartridge, fire it, feed a cartridge, fire it, feed a cartridge, fire it. Easy, right? The difference in standard full auto is that on the 3-round burst setting, the trigger is activated 2 more times while this is going backwards. On the full auto setting, the trigger is not reset to fire a subsequent round until the whole action comes forward, and that's what gives it the lower rate of fire. So with that hopefully conceptually in hand, let's take a look at just the guts of the system here. This is the barrel. On this particular one, it's solid. This is a dummy action. This is the recoil spring. This is the gas system, the gas tube right here. It's got a piston in it, sort of, connected to this arm. We have a pair of toothed gear wheels here. The bolt itself is this guy, right in there. This is what's actually connected to the charging handle. So when we rotate that handle on the outside of the action, this guy, it's hooking onto this thing and rotating it. It's rather hard to do without proper leverage. When the gas system operates, flip this around right side up, what's going to happen is this arm is going to come back and it's going to act kind of like the steam piston arm on a locomotive engine. So when this comes back, it's going to rotate these 2 wheels, push this up. That eventually will unlock the bolt. So we have a little lock right there. Get this from this side. So you can see this little arm disengages. If I can get the right bits to move here. There we go. It starts to disengage. If I had enough strength in my thumb to cycle this the whole way, what it would eventually do is rotate this bolt upward. So the chamber is right now pointing that way. When it rotates upward, then it's in position to feed. So this is our feed plunger, which is going to cycle up and down. It's going to push a cartridge out of the front of this magazine, push it down into the chamber, poking out an unexpended dud round, if there's one in there. Then the drum bolt rotates forward, and it's ready to fire. This is going to sound very odd, but I feel the need to point out that as far as field stripping goes, this is actually an extremely simple rifle. I mean, like, boom, I've field stripped the front assembly, and it's basically the same process for the back. And cleaning is also a pretty simple deal because built into the pistol grip here, if I rotate that 90 degrees, look at that, I've got a cleaning brush. You might normally think, well, where's your cleaning rod? Well, they didn't bother with a cleaning rod on this because, forget it, you're not getting into this thing anyway. Instead, what you do is just take your charging handle, rotate it open to right there, where, by the way, it does stick intentionally. We can then look down inside there and see straight up into the chamber. So what's the cleaning procedure? Take chamber brush, clean it out, done. Now, if this gets to the point where you need to detail strip it, you're totally screwed. But as far as the actual maintenance that's expected of an individual soldier, simply to be able to clean out the chamber, etc., they did a pretty good job on this. As complicated, as insanely complicated as the action is, it is a unitized sort of action, and everything else that you have to deal with around it is pretty simple. Okay, we have been playing around with this thing a little bit and figured out a bit more, which is really cool. First off, there is a tool which allows you to manually cycle the action. So this, I don't know if this is an official tool or just something that someone here at HK put together for this demonstrator action. But once we have this locked into the cylinder here, now I can fully cycle this, and you can actually watch that cartridge lifter or finger go down, push the round in, come back up, and then locks back in place. So a 360-degree rotation of this cylinder fully cycles the action. So you can see the finger right there pushing down. That'll clear the chamber if necessary, and then feed a round in, and now it's ready again. If we look at it from this side, right there, you can see the chamber open. It just looks like a black hole there, but that goes down into it, and then ready to go again. So that's the action cycling dry. Now I have a couple of dummy cartridges here. We can lock the magazine in place. That's how it would go in. And then if I do this again, it will actually chamber one of our dummy rounds. Now, unfortunately, you can't really see anything here because the whole action's sealed up. But we now have, go ahead and release our magazine. We now have only one dummy round there. You can't see anything here because the other dummy round is actually in the chamber, currently aligned that way, ready to fire. And if I cycle this one more time, this cartridge finger right there is going to punch it out the ejection port on the bottom of the action. You can actually see the base of the cartridge just barely right there. And there we go. That is going to push it out the bottom of the action, where it then gets stuck because I wasn't holding it. There we go. If you're not trying to do this in slow motion upside down, this does spit the cartridge out fairly reliably. So the new funding that became available in 1984 led directly to the G11 being put into troop trials by 1988. Development had gone far enough that HK was ready for it, the German military was ready for it. They did their trials, they worked pretty well. In 1989, they added the K2 version here, Construction 2, with the extra magazines well, I was going to say in the stock, but sort of down the entire length of the gun. And everything was looking pretty good. In fact, by March of 1990, the German military authorities formally certified this rifle as approved for use by the German military. The plan was to put it into mass production and to equip the entire Bundeswehr with G11s. Sounds pretty good, and then geopolitics intrudes. Right about this same time, if we look at the bigger picture, the Berlin Wall is coming down, East and West Germany are reunifying, and the Soviet Union is crumbling. Well, the whole point of the G11, the whole point of the West German military was, of course, defense primarily against the Soviet Union. With it falling apart, one of the major threats to German political sovereignty is going away. At the same time, the German government is looking at a tremendous amount of money that it's going to need for the reunification, for rebuilding East Germany. They have also received acquired a giant mountainous stockpile of East German AK-74s. So they now have a whole ton more armaments. They have fewer people that they're potentially going to need to use them on. And they have this huge new expense coming out. And all of these things work together to kill the G11 program. It's going to be expensive, and now it just doesn't look all that necessary. So the German parliament formally canceled the adoption plan for the G11 in the fall of 1990, and that was pretty much the end of the line for the rifle. Now, of course, it was at this same approximate time going through the US ACR trials, and those went well. There were 15 G11 K2s in the ACR trials program. These guns put about 4,000 rounds downrange each. They all worked well, but as a whole package, when you looked at the logistics and the cost and the accuracy and everything else, the US government decided that they weren't an overall improvement over the M16. In fact, none of the ACR trials rifles were. None of them were adopted. The program simply ended with no change to the US military rifle system. So that had been the last hope for the G11. With it gone as well, this program pretty much just ended. And we were left with a very small number of these rifles existing anywhere. Here at HK's Gray Room in Virginia, they have this particular one complete rifle. They also have three other earlier ones, which are basically dummy shells with just some solid metal internals to give them weight. There are some at HK in Oberndorf, I expect, and there are a few dotting around military museums worldwide, mostly the countries, the militaries that actually did some testing with these. So it is extremely uncommon to be able to find them, and I am very grateful to HK here for giving me access to this one to pull apart and show you. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video.